invite the panelists to come up to the stage, and I'll ask the chair to kick off. So the chair is Mr. Rana Ihsan Afzal Khan, the coordinator to the Prime Minister on Commerce and Industries of Pakistan. We have as panelists, Mr. Mohammed Masood Rana Chaudhry, the Joint Secretary, Economic Relations Division, Ministry of Finance of Bangladesh. We like to invite Mr. Pema Tewang, the Senior Planning Officer, District Administration, Winse of Bhutan. We'd like to invite Mr. Keval Prasad Bandari, Secretary, National Planning Commission of Nepal. And then Ms. Anita Turab, Joint Secretary of the Economic Affairs Division of Pakistan Department. Sorry. Mr. Priyanta Ratnayake, the Deputy Secretary to the Treasury of Sri Lanka. Mr. Yusuf Esidir, Expert Strategy and Budget Office of the Presidency of Turkey. And do we have the CSO representative here too? Ms. Samina Nasir, President of PODA in Pakistan. And then online we have Dr. Famida Khatun, the Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue of Bangladesh. And I have to apologize if she's online. Yesterday we had connectivity problems, so we were not able to hear her in the energy session. And then last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Hamza Malik from SCAP, who will deliver the lead presentation. So if I may pass the microphone to the chair. Yes.
My session is next one.
Oh, your session is the next one?
Because there is no room, you see.
Is that the reason why the next one, or is it?
No, because.
So.
Are you ready for it?
So thank you so much. So our topic today is strengthening means of implementation to advance progress on SDGs, financing for development. And I would like to start by appreciating STPI, SANS, SCAP for this massive exercise where we will be learning from each other. We'll be sharing ideas and reaffirming our commitment to the SDG goals of 2030. So this exercise is very much important each year to review where we are and what to do next. So overall, Pakistan has made good progress on the SDGs. We've seen the SDG index score increase from 53 to 63% from 2015 to 2020. But after that, the world has gone through a lot of shocking incidents, and one of them was COVID-19. And when the world was just getting out of that COVID-19, we suffered from the Russian-Ukraine war that led to a super commodity cycle. And then, you've seen the energy crisis now taking on the world. And we're talking about recession. We're talking about slowing down of economies world over. And after that, sadly, Pakistan was hit by floods this summer, which gave a dent of almost $30 billion to the economy of Pakistan. It's going to be a tough road ahead in rehabilitating all the losses. So with these challenges, I think the SDG challenge has been doubled down for Pakistan, and also for many other developing countries which are going through similar economic crises. So I think financing for development, we have to start by tax capacity is required for an inclusive and sustainable growth. Most sustainable sources of finance is domestic revenue. Therefore, taxation is the center of development practices. Some multinational financing institute place the benchmark for developing countries that tax to GDP should be around 15%. When we left the government, the PMLN government left in 2018, it was around 11% of GDP. And when we took over this April, it was around 8.5% of GDP. So obviously we are lacking behind there, and hence gradually increasing the ratio through a comprehensive tax policy and administrative reforms is a major objective of this government. Similarly, in Pakistan, after the 18th Amendment, the provinces are supposed to be generating their own revenue, but up till now we've seen that their resource mobilization is 20%, 15 to 20% of their total revenues. So that area is, where the provinces need to step up, and there are many, there are great potential there. So in the coming years, we see that agriculture is a sector which is lacking behind. They need to be generating finance from there. Similarly, we've just started point of sale, which is, taxing services from in restaurants. So that is an area which needs a lot of work on. And so Pakistan has needs to, really bring this tax ratio upwards, and the potential is there. The government needs to, double down on collecting taxes, including technology in it, like POS. So this area is where we need to work on. Another important aspect when we talk about finance, specifically talking about Pakistan, are state-owned enterprises. And we have almost, 200 state-owned enterprises where the world has, the world governments have moved away from doing businesses. We've seen that in Pakistan, that is still continuing. And, we have examples like the Pakistan Steel Mills, the PIA, which we haven't been able to turn around. And the efficiency of these companies is way beyond, less than 50%, 30% of the, private sector. So a lot of finance of the government gets drained in, covering the losses of these companies. So we need to, we realize this, and moving forward, I think this is an area which needs to be taken care of. But I believe in Pakistan specifically, it's only possible if, there is an understanding between the political stakeholders that politics will be taken out of it. And if that is, ensured, I think this objective of, taking these 200 plus companies out of the balance sheet of the Pakistan government will be possible. So, maybe a broader charter of economy, or, an understanding between the political parties, and this thing can move forward. Next, I think, the major issue I see with Pakistan finance, or, the fiscal deficit, something which adds on to it, is the power sector in Pakistan. It is witnessed that there are massive inefficiencies. We see that even today, it's 2022, and we have discos, electric distribution companies in Pakistan, where their collection is, 80%. They're not collecting, the shortfall is 20%. It's massive. So this government has ensured that we will be, coming up with a policy of purchasing AMI meters universally. So over a period of time, the regular meters are replaced by AMI meters, and we're able to, fulfill this shortfall. Similarly, there is, finance required to invest in this sector to ensure that line losses come to the international standards. The international standards are 4 to 5%, where, we are hovering around 19% technical losses. So that is an area. So if these investments are made, then obviously we will be able to make electricity cheaper, because the loss of technical losses plus the theft is being paid by the common man. It is being, the base bill includes all these losses. So that is an area which needs a lot. So Pakistan is also one of the few countries with a massive domestic gas distribution network, which is highly inefficient. It should be a long-term goal of the government to make electricity affordable, and the source for cooking in the future, where gas should be utilized in a much more efficient sector. The source for cooking should be electricity, like it is in Europe. So that is a target area which I think we should be working towards. Politics, again, needs to be taken out of the pricing of electricity. It needs to be taken out of the pricing of gas. It needs to be taken out of the pricing of petrol. So, this is an area where if there is consensus among the political stakeholders, then it is possible. If not, this is a difficult agenda then. So when this happens, this is going to free up a lot of finance, which can be then used in fulfilling the SDG goals. Another big challenge that Pakistan faces is rupee devaluation. In the last 5 years, we've witnessed that the rupee has devaluated more than 100%, which is, to me, I feel that it is abnormal. And the major reason behind it is the difference between the import and export of Pakistan. Last year, Pakistan exported around 31 billion US dollars of goods, and then we imported almost 81, 82 billion. So that's a $50 billion deficit, trade deficit. And then, we have these remittances coming in, but we need to live within our means. And the two big things where I believe, can make a big difference in the short term are our food imports. We've seen that, Pakistan is an agri-based economy, and, if we're able to, palm oil, for example, is a $3-4 billion import, and there are areas in Pakistan where palm oil can be grown. We're working on this. The government, the planning ministry is working on this. So that import can be reduced. Pakistan can become, we don't need to be importing wheat. So our yields are, some of the food commodities, our yields are 1/4 or 1/5 of the international averages. So that speaks a lot about where our agriculture sector is today. So that is an area where we can, really bring in savings. The second one, obviously, is the energy import, and that is massive in Pakistan. So this government now is focusing on solarization. We plan to, we've introduced a solar policy, and we're inviting investment from across the world to invest in solar projects. So the basic idea is that we install 10,000, 20,000 megawatts of solar panels in Pakistan, and we substitute that with furnace oil, and the payback is 3 to 4 years. So that will be, that will help us reduce this import bill, and we can, take care of this issue. So similarly, this is import substitution that I've been talking about. On the export side, I think the Pakistan has a lot of potential in the IT area. We have a lot of potential in the tourism area. If we're able to, work efficiently on these two areas, we feel that this gap that I've been talking about, the trade deficit, can be covered. And this will give good financial space to the government, again, to, be focusing on the SDG related development agenda. With that, I think political stability is the foremost for an economy to thrive and attract foreign investment. This is a area which has been weak on Pakistan. The government has a crucial role to play in advancing the agenda of improvement in spending efficiency in a transparent manner, improving domestic revenue mobilization, improving the business climate, encouraging private investment are all priorities of our government. With that, thank you so much for your time, and I'll be looking forward to listening to great ideas coming from the panelists. Thank you. Gigi, I have it. So I'd be inviting Mr. Naveed Javed. So the lead presentation is by Dr. Hamza Malik. Right. He's the chief economist of Ministry of Planning and Development, Government of Pakistan.
No, I'm not. I'm Hamza Malik, Director, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development.
Apologies, Director.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm Hamza Ali Malik, Director, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development, based in ASCAP, Bangkok. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Chair, for setting the scene. My job here is to highlight some issues which hopefully will be taken up further by the panelists, and we'll hear specific country examples in some instances. So I'll talk about two broad areas. One is the current macroeconomic context, and I'll try and show you some visuals to keep things there, not a lot of text. And then I leave you with some policy ideas for discussion and debate, and hopefully we'll hear some examples from the countries and from the panelists. Next slide, please. The three broad messages I want to leave you with, I'll put them up front. One, the current difficult economic conditions represented by lower economic growth, for instance, and higher inflation are making it very difficult to effectively continue to pursue sustainable development goals. And we expect very difficult years, at least next 2 to 3 years are going to be very difficult. So it's not going to be a hunky-dory situation as we had a few years ago where we were very optimistic. Right now, things are looking rather pessimistic. And as I said, I'll show you some data on that. Number two, there has been a substantial increase in fiscal deficits and consequently debt levels in the country. At the same time, inflation is on the rise, which means interest rates have risen, which in turn having a feedback effect on future debt servicing costs, making debt positions even more difficult. So enhancing financing for sustainable development is going to become quite challenging in the coming years. Third is a little bit on the optimistic note. There are several policy options that are available to member states, which they can consider, pursue, implement. Some are immediate and short term, some require more time, and hence are medium and long term in nature. The key thing is implementation requires serious political will. And it's lacking in many areas, especially in South Asia. I'll give you some examples during the course of my presentation. It requires a series of reforms going forward as well. Next slide, please. So this is a basic picture. I won't belabor it too much. You can see the whole world went down. This is the data for Asia and the Pacific quarterly GDP. There are 4 different sub-regions of Asia and the Pacific. You can simply eyeball and see there was a synchronized recession back in 2020, which was the lowest in June 2020 across the board. Some had more deeper, for instance, South Asia, which is the green line, I believe. And then they all started to recover again at different speeds. The interesting thing to note is the last part. If I had a pointer or something, I show you, but towards the end, you can see a very clear divergence appearing between performance in different sub-regions. This is what we call a K-shaped recovery. Some regions, sub-regions are doing better, some are not. Central Asia is actually not doing very well. South Asia, thanks to India's strong performance and recovery, is doing much better. Same is the situation, which I'm not showing here, if you look at the country level information within sub-regions. So there's a lot of concern on countries being left behind, populations, segments of sectors within economies being left behind as well, right? So these are risky times. What we call in UN, let's leave no one behind, or other words, there are risks of rising inequality and poverty levels. Right-hand side, no, hold on. Right-hand side is simply the estimates of the loss that has already occurred across Asia and the Pacific. This is about $2 trillion has already been lost. There are going to be what we call scarring effects. Without going in details, for instance, labor market has been disrupted in a major manner. A lot of workers have lost their skills. Their ability to go back to the job market has been affected. So that's adversely affects the future prospects of employment and so on and so forth. Similarly, there has been evidence emerging on learning deficits. A lot of children were left out of schools. So the prospects of a strong long-term potential growth actually looks a bit lower as well. Next slide, please. The other one is the inflation. Same thing. You don't have to really pay a lot of attention, except it is going up. There are 3 lines. One is the food, one is the core, one is the overall inflation. First point to note, it started going up since mid-2021, much before the war in Ukraine. So a lot of people tend to confuse that the war in Ukraine certainly give the impetus to inflationary trends, so on and so forth. That is not the case. The reason is Asia-Pacific countries injected huge amount of support, both monetary and fiscal measures, into the system. According to our estimates, about $1.8 trillion were injected in the system. That money did not disappear in thin air. That led to inflationary pressures with a bit of a lag. So inflation started to go up around September 2021. And then, of course, things were exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. So it's not only a food inflation process, the core inflation, subtracting food, actually inflation is also going up. The right-hand panel simply shows the data for different countries. South and South Asia, which is the focus of discussion today, is highlighted in red. So some countries, for instance, Sri Lanka, unfortunately, Islamic Republic of Iran and Pakistan are experiencing extremely high levels of inflation, which is certainly creating serious problems on all sorts of fronts, in particular, inclusive development part that we were talking the other day in another session. Next slide, please. So what is the reaction of have been of the policymakers, right? They have been increasing interest rates. You can see a distinct change in the policy approach in the left-hand graph. So the blue is showing countries that have had interest rates reduction, and red is the interest rate increases. And the four lines are 2019, 2020, 21, and 2022. You can easily see in 2019, or even to some extent in 2020, countries were reducing interest rates to try to support economic activity and so on and so forth. That is certainly not the case. Situation has absolutely reversed. Bulk of countries are now increasing interest rates to try and address inflation, which I think is the right approach. The right side shows the data for Asian Pacific countries, the most right extreme. Again, not very different from the pattern. They're also beginning to increase interest rates significantly. Next slide, please. This is again a point that needs to be debated, but a lot of policymakers' debate tends to be, well, they have to increase interest rates because US and other advanced countries are increasing interest rates, and they should not do that. Well, that's not entirely true. However, if countries do not, domestic economies do not increase the interest rates to address their domestic inflationary pressures, there's still going to be dynamics not very favorable to them. So if US continues to increase the interest rates, their dollar is going to be stronger, has already strengthened quite a bit. As a consequence, exchange rate, which is just another price, will depreciate. The left-hand side simply shows significant depreciations that have been experienced by Asia-Pacific countries across the board. I put these arrows against the South Asian countries just to highlight them. Turkey, Pakistan tops the charts in terms of the degree of exchange rate depreciation. The right-hand side is a sort of a proxy for risk premium. So you look at the secondary market data for 10-year bond yields, anything over 5%, I've shown over here. In some cases, a lot of South Asian countries are showing up on that, which means from the investor's point of view, these countries are perceived risky in terms of financing or putting money in those economies for all sorts of reasons. We're not discussing them. Hopefully we have more details from the panelists. Next slide, please. This is the fiscal space aspect. So of course, as I was mentioning earlier, countries responded very aggressively, and rightly so, in 2020 by increasing fiscal deficits considerably. So there's a huge dip that you see in fiscal deficits across the board. These are the averages for Asia and the Pacific. And then you see this forecast, a very interesting food for thought for some students. I'm assuming they're here. People tend to, these are IMF numbers. So some people tend to think they are forecasts and projections. They are not. They're essentially IMF desires. So implicit in these numbers is basically a plan for fiscal consolidation or a recommendation for fiscal consolidation. There's a huge dip in fiscal deficit, but you're not seeing next 5 years deficits increase, becoming worse. Well, they are implicitly assuming countries are going to take a lot of steps to try and stem further decline in fiscal deficits. There are both pros and cons of this approach. The key issue being spending should not be cut on areas which has a direct bearing on sustainable development prospects. I'll touch upon that in the policy prescriptions part. The right-hand side is the debt implications. Again, massive increases in debt. So these are becoming serious policy issues being debated now, and they have a direct bearing on prospects of financing sustainable development, one of the most critical means of implementing sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. This is just the data for debt across the region. In the interest of time, I won't highlight the point, except you can see the red ones in particular are the increases in debt levels in the last 3 years. And again, I've pointed out the South Asian countries in the blue bar. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to the policy side. Next slide, please. Okay, the first one, inflation. So unless and until we don't control inflation, the pressure on interest rates to increase is always going to remain there. It's a very contested topic. We can have an entire seminar on just that, pros and cons of increasing interest rates to control inflation or not. I leave it actually, maybe if you have time for discussion, what panelists or what the audience think actually, whether increases in interest rates can be effective in controlling inflation. And more importantly, for the purpose of today's talk, what are the implications of rising interest rates for the prospects of financing for development? But inflation is something that cannot be ignored. And as a consequences, the trends in interest rates that cannot be ignored. Countries are going to be under huge political pressures to not try and increase interest rates for many reasons, which are legitimate. However, they should be prepared for further depreciations of the currency. So that's hardcore trade-off that they're facing. Let's jump straight to the financing options that are available. First and foremost, I think the UN system, what we propose is countries should, and countries are actually already developing and implementing what we call integrated national financing frameworks. In plain, simple words, all it means is when countries try and articulate their development spending needs, it should be backed with a reasonable, clear financing plan. It's one thing to say, I want to spend on social protection, health, education, so on and so forth. They can have a long list of priorities, which is understandable from a political standpoint of view. From the technical and economist standpoint of view, what it means is how you're going to pay for that. Are they going to be increased in taxes to pay for that? Are you going to raise financing? If so, how and how much, and so on and so forth. This framework helps you organize these kind of considerations. And that's the framework that has been adopted globally, led by the UN by 193 countries. And I believe it's been implemented across the board as well. Close to 150 countries at least have a broader framework in place in the planning ministries in most cases. So just to give you an example, next slide, please. We did some technical work in the first component of financing requirements. The very first step has to be estimating what we call SDG costing. How much would it need? How much investments do we need to implement SDGs? We did that work back in 2019. We worked with several countries trying to have their own estimates. For Asia Pacific region as a whole, our estimates were on average 5 years of 5% of GDP per year was needed to invest in SDGs from 2019 onwards. This is the graphs for data for South Asia region. Actually, my chair is in front of the screen, probably you want to look at here. You can see for least developing countries, this requirement is enormous. There's no way they can actually meet these financing requirements on their own. For least developing countries, this is on average 16%, but in some cases as high as 20% per year, which is pretty much unachievable. South Asia, the region, has one of the highest requirements of financing SDGs compared to rest of the region. So let me show you the data for South Asia. Next slide, please. This is a very interesting and powerful, useful graph. I think I used the same one last year as well. It's worth repeating over here. The left-hand side simply shows our estimates of the additional SDG investment needs. Let's take, for example, Pakistan. So our estimates shows Pakistan needs around 17% of GDP worth of financing or investments to effectively pursue sustainable development goals per year. What is happening in practice is the right-hand panel, which shows, according to the actual data, actual financial flows that are going towards SDGs. That is, and I'm talking about Pakistan's case, the blue bar is around 1%. So you need 17%, you're putting 1%. So then we said, okay, maybe the governments are getting charged now, and they're going to step up efforts and try and bring in more financing and investments towards SDGs. Let's assume they double their financial flows. What happens then? The maximum number they still reach is, I think in Pakistan's case, it reaches about 2.5% or under 3%. Still nowhere near what is required. The point is very simple. The requirements are enormous, and what is actually going towards SDGs is nowhere near compared to that. A lot of developing countries cannot do it on their own. Hence, we have these kind of multi-stakeholder consultations, dialogues to learn from each other, which country is doing what, and I'll try and highlight some examples of that. Next slides. This are the focusing on enhancing fiscal space, which is, to me, at least my understanding, the core of a policy response when it comes to financing SDGs. Chair also alluded to some of these points, for instance, strengthening the need for taxation and so on and so forth. So there's some immediate terms, you can say low-hanging fruits that can and should be considered, and we are at ASCAP working with some countries on these lines. For instance, leveraging technology, artificial intelligence in particular, to try and improve the capacity of tax administrators to increase revenue collection. So we're working with Bhutan, Cambodia, and a few other countries. We have been reached out by FBR in Pakistan as well. So next year we'll be working on those things. There's a huge potential actually. You're not talking about levying new taxes, simply using data and technology in a smart manner to try and actually increase revenue collection. The second point is improving public spending efficiency. This seems like a very normal kind of statement. We say it all the time as economists, improve efficiency. But there are huge differences in Asia and the Pacific when it comes to assessing, getting the same outcomes from very different amounts of money. By as high as 30%. Some countries getting this exact same outcome in terms of schooling or healthcare and so on and so forth. However, the amount of money they spend to get there is very different because the efficiencies involved are considerable. Let me share one more observation, a little bit different. In our engagement with policymakers, with finance ministers, especially in South Asia, including in Pakistan now, we hear this thing consistently, we need money and we need money now. A lot of finance ministers say that. Understandable. In Pakistan's case, there have been floods. Requirements to spend for humanitarian needs are urgent and significant, fair enough. However, there's a lot of domestic homework that needs to be done as well, which is not being done. Tax GDP ratios in South Asia are one of the worst in the world for 30 to 40 years. Pakistan is no exception. We continue as a whole, as the world and South Asia in particular, spend enormous amount of money on defense and on subsidies. And then we complain and say, we don't have the resources. I tend to disagree. I think countries have resources. They are choosing different priorities to spend them on. So there are significant gains to be had if you can rechannel, reprioritize some of the spending towards SDGs. Then there are other considerations which are more tricky, more technical, and more political, such as debt restructuring. However, our advice is, and we have begun working with countries on, this conversation needs to be had. That's the point we are highlighting as global platforms as well in G20 and other fora. We cannot avoid talking about that. Providing debt relief for a temporary time, 1 year, 6 months, is just pushing the can a bit further, doesn't solve the underlying problem, right? So these are kind of conversation with UN, along with IMF and World Bank and others are now pursuing and pushing that there is a need to actually go in that direction to try and create space for the fiscal authorities so they can actually spend resources on SDG priorities. Next slide, please. Then there are, and this one I'll be very brief here. There are some long-term reforms that need to be put in place. Long-term in the sense, if you start instituting these reforms now, the benefits are going to be reaped later on. Enhancing or promoting domestic savings, for instance, or developing capital markets. Without that, you cannot actually have financing coming towards in the system and going towards investment requirements of all sorts. That requires attention. There are several other points here. Chair, with the interest of time, I won't mention them one by one. Hopefully some examples will emerge from the panelists from discussions. So I think audience will be more interested in hearing what countries are doing, especially my colleague and friend from Sri Lanka. Hopefully will share how their country is actually instituting some of these policies as well. Similar ideas are there for the multilateral purposes. One interesting area is tackling illicit financial flows, for instance, avoid tax evasion and tax avoidance aspects going cross-border. That's one area of that. So there's a lot of work going on in the UN system, trying to stem those kind of illicit financial flows. There's a lot of work going on what we call thematic bonds. They're investors who are conscious about going green or supporting only green development. However, the financial markets in many developing countries needs to be reformed to be able to ready to channel that kind of investments for their purpose. Next slide, please. I have 2 more, I'll be done. Let's skip that in the interest of time. Okay, so just a quick word on what I just mentioned, developing sustainable finance ecosystem. So as I said, increasingly, a lot of investors are now not just interested in financing or providing what is called fungible money, giving resources and letting the government choose where they want to invest. They want to link their investments with some very clearly targeted outcomes, whether it be green, social, or sustainability linked, they call GSS bonds, for instance, instruments or outcomes, right? So there's a whole ecosystem that needs to be developed. That's an area where SCAP is now very actively working in at least a dozen countries across the region. Different components of that, be it the green bond framework. We're working with Sri Lanka very closely on that, for instance. Green taxonomies is one area. Debt for nature swaps is another area, and so on and so forth. This area has a huge potential. It still throws a very interesting questions. So when you issue green bonds, you're still accumulating debt. So why would you advise issuing more debt when countries are facing high debt already? Well, a quick answer and response is you end up attracting investors which you're not attracting with conventional bonds. And then once you start developing that markets, the yields will come down as a whole across the board. It will facilitate your development of capital markets going forward. Number 2, when sovereign issue these bonds, corporates and other smaller local investors can actually start issuing their bonds as well. This is how it's happening now in many countries, Cambodia, for instance, in particular, Indonesia, which issues very specific bonds for certain purposes without accumulating a lot of debt. Next slide. So this is the last one, and I'll stop after that. I'm very conscious of the time here. 1 minute, right? Thanks. So focus on, it's a difficult area to understand what do you mean by sustainable finance. People use the term ESG investments all the time, right? It's not very clear immediately what you mean. So I like to call them as two tracks. One is what I call sustainable use outcome-based finance, which means the investments are clearly marked where the money is going to go. This example is green bonds. You issue a bond under a commitment that whatever proceeds are raised will be invested in a certain green project. It could be energy transition, it could be many other examples, but as long as it is clearly articulated, it is not fungible money which can be used for untargeted subsidies, for instance. That part is clear. Spectacular growth is taking place in Asia and the Pacific, albeit in few countries, led by China. India is one of the leaders, and then many advanced countries, of course, Hong Kong, China, and Macau, and I think New Zealand, Australia. Advanced countries are ahead of that. Huge potential in developing countries to go in that direction, try and tap resources, get investors to finance money. The other part, which what I call sustainably managed finance. So a lot of investors claim they're actually putting finance or managing their finance, which is supporting ESG, environment, social, and governance aspect. But the link between ESG investments and the impact on SDGs or green part is not clear. There's a term you might have heard called greenwashing, right? So those concerns have been raised repeatedly again and again. That requires attention. So our recommendation is very simple in the green below here. For the first track, countries need to scale access to this sustainable finance. It's clearly going for the purpose. They need to increase the scale. It's already growing tremendously. For the second track, countries need to strengthen this finance to be more sustainable. Enormous amount of money is there claiming that they're supporting sustainable activities, but actually they are not. Next slides. You can leave them over here. These are the recommendations how to channel sustainable finance. In the interest of time, I stop here. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Look forward to hearing from country examples and experiences. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you. That was Dr. Hamza Malik, Director, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division, SCAP, Thailand. Next up, we have Dr. Fahmida Khatoon, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. She'll be joining us online. Okay. So we have Mr. Pima Tishwang, Senior Planning Officer, District Administration, Luste, Bhutan. Please.
Honorable Chair, distinguished delegates, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually very honored and privileged to be part of this August gathering, and particularly to be the part of this panelist for this very important session, post-COVID financing. And therefore, I'd like to emulate some highlights as to how Bhutan is preparing to ensure post-COVID financing for the resilient and sustainable development as the impacts of COVID-19 and evolving situations in and around the world loom large. Generally, the COVID-19 has significantly affected Bhutan's economy and people's livelihood. Immense pressure on the already limited budget of the government has been experienced. Not much investments have been able to be made owing to the lack of financing. Therefore, the government of Bhutan is in the process of putting a very concerted effort to elevate the impacts of COVID-19 and ensure its swift and resilient recovery. Some of the proactive measures adopted by the government of Bhutan thus far include: first, the revision of tourism policy and branding of tourism products and services so as to maximize the benefits for both the visitors as well as the government. And then another measure is launching of the National Credit Guarantee Scheme in October 2020 as a counter-cyclical policy measure aimed to enhance access to finance with 100% debt financing for startups, removal of requirement for collateral replaced by the minimal equity in the cottage and small category, and cheaper interest rates on working capital loans to encourage businesses. Third, revision of property tax bill in the recent parliament, which is aimed at enhancing domestic resource mobilization besides ensuring accountability and improved public services. Introduction of clean wage system for the civil servants, where the allowances are made part of the pay, has also been considered. And the fifth measure that we have initiated is the deprioritization of less priority capital activities and first tracking of those activities which would contribute towards gainful job creation and sustainable enhancement of the economy. Then the sixth measure include adoption of stringent temporary fiscal disciplines in the agencies in order to curtail avoidable expenses at this time of the crisis. Last but not the least, in collaboration with the UNDP, we are also developing innovation financing strategy to venture into new financing areas. However, a country in its individuality cannot tackle its problems. Therefore, the international and regional cooperation and collaboration, sense of fraternity and mutual responsibility should continue to prevail as always, and even more during this unprecedented time of the crisis. Thank you for your kind attention and your time.
Next, we have Mr. Keval Prasad Bhandari, Secretary, National Planning Commission, Nepal. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity. So we have this opportunity to repeating every panel and every sessions because of the very limited participant from our country. The lead presentation make the clear picture of our region. Our views only enrich Dr. Malik's presentation because the outlook of South and Southwest economies are already presented, and it's the situation of how we are going to finance SDG and other development goal. COVID-19 has impacted negatively, especially on health, people's livelihood, employment, and economic growth. Nepal faces -2% negative growth in 2020-21. So this is a huge impact of domestic financing, and to minimize this impact, Nepal government has increased its investment on public health markedly, and fiscal and monetary measures were adopted. A stimulus package for employment and labor market, and supporting private organizations, including from monetary policy also. And the result is growth rate has been achieved during last 2 years after COVID. It's the positive growth is in place. We have another development aspiration. Nepal is graduating from LDC status in 2026. So without meeting GNI per capita, economic vulnerability index and human asset index is very good. But if after COVID and other shocks, the global shocks and the domestic shocks, creating more hurdle in our economy. So I think we will definitely achieve GNI per capita threshold during the time frame, but we need to improve our economic vulnerability and human asset by disaster and climate change risk. So our financing is concentrated on those areas. Official development assistance mostly focus on social and the infrastructure and productive capacity building to meet the other economic criteria. Domestic revenue reached 25% of GDP compared to 9% in 33 decades ago. So our economy is slow performing, not that bad performance, but our tax policy reform and strengthening tax administration will definitely help for financing on SDG. The ODA is 11.2% of the domestic budget, though grant has been decreasing. And when we are in the LDC graduated, so we will definitely receive less grants, and we need to accept more IDA and other development assistance, especially in credit. So that is another area of economy where we need to perform well. Otherwise, it's very hard to work on that. Another important source for funding SDG is private investment, but foreign direct investment is not performing well. So domestic investment from private sector for industry and other service area need to improve. Otherwise, it's very hard to finance the SDG. Official development assistance still occupies the essential phase of health, education, and other services. So if that reduces from the bilateral or multilateral after after being graduated from LDC, that will definitely suffer our regular social development financing. The government of Nepal is facing other challenges in financing development, such as increasing the absorptive capacity of decreasing absorptive capacity of development assistance, and the capital expenditure. The expenditure on capital is also lacking behind. So the capacity of foreign aid by addressing policy and institutional issues, enhancing the export capacity of the economy. Nepal is also facing, as Chair says earlier, that our trade deficit is very huge. So it's very hard to manage these gaps for financing domestic resources. However, there is an urgent need of structural transformation, especially on our aid architecture. The traditional concept of financing from development partner or multilateral is not going to address the SDGs and other development needs. So the regular communication with the development partners on redesigning aid architecture, how government of Nepal need to finance after the restructure of government. Earlier we have unitary government, now we have federal, state, and provincial and local government need more financing from central government to achieve the SDG, because we are mostly focused on SDG localization to achieve the target from their development activity. We need to reduce the gap between commitment and disbursement of development finances. Many development partners committed in many sectors of financing, but the disbursement is very low. Even the disbursement of multilateral is still low due to the low performing of the project management and other things. So if we are able to improve on that, the disbursement will increase and our development effectiveness will cover the SDG and other. In view of the growing requirement of finance for development, the need for consolidating the role of the private sector, so government has making several doing businesses policies so that private sector will come and finance on the related area. We also need more support from enhancing domestic resource mobilization from public-private partnership. We are working on this, but not a single project, a landmark project, we are able to do on public-private partnership. And there is a concept of blended finance, but especially for focusing SDG, but we are unable to mobilize the resources under blended finance. So Nepal need to work seriously, and the investment which we are doing in SDG from last 7 years and the coming 8 years the trend didn't show that we will achieve SDG on 2020-30. So if we were able to improve our financing on SDG, if we able to improve our implementation capacity, and if we are able to improve our country and capacity, we will able to achieve the SDG. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Keval Prasad Bhandari, Secretary, National Planning Commission, Nepal. Next up, we have Ms. Anita Turab, Joint Secretary, EAD Government of Pakistan. She had. So next we have Mr. Priyantha Ratanyaki, Deputy Secretary to the Treasury, Sri Lanka. Please welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Fellow panelists, distinguished participant, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on this important topic. I think the financing remains our greatest challenge for SDG acceleration. I thank Mr. Hamza for his very comprehensive presentation, where he has touched on very specific issues and came up with potential policy consideration as well. So most of the points he has shared, I think as a country, Sri Lanka also shares that. We are yet to conduct a proper assessment to identify the required financial commitment towards implementing the SDG. But in 2020, the UN in Sri Lanka estimated the funding gap for SDG at USD 2 to 4 billion per annum. This could even be higher at present due to the contraction of the economy consequent to the COVID-19 pandemic. And many gains achieved in respect of SDG are at risk of being reversed. We basically, I mean, most of our countries are basically relying on government finances and official development assistance for SDG implementation. The current government revenue in Sri Lanka generated through taxes is deemed weak, and the government has already taken measures to revise our tax structure, increasing direct and indirect tax rates, and also broadening the tax base, and much delayed reforms in state-owned enterprises and the pricing the structures. Sri Lanka is currently going through a difficult and challenging period. So the question is how to mobilize adequate resources for SDG implementation while managing the crisis. So that's the serious discussion in front of us. Now, given the limited fiscal space in the budget, accelerating progress on SDGs would require aligning private sector investment, as well as tapping into new types of blending finances, and also exploring opportunities for alternative as well as innovative means of financing for SDG. This become critical to expand the funding envelope. Some of these measures have already been discussed at various panel discussions. Now, as already explained, in the post-COVID period, many countries are experiencing multiple economic challenges. As explained by Mr. Hamza, slowing down of economic growth, high fiscal deficit, rising inflation and interest rate, and high government debts are common to all of our countries. So in my opinion, the countries cannot manage this crisis only with homegrown solutions. We need much more collaborative effort and partnerships, as we've seen in the COVID pandemic time. So in this context, the proposal put forward by the federal minister for planning, development, and the special initiatives at the inaugural session is important. He called for this platform to have one voice of Southwest Asian and the other developing countries, that we need some kind of different treatment in terms of this servicing, and also global financing institutions to continuously provide long-term concessional financing to the affected countries, enabling them to continue with their development agenda. So I think this proposal is very much relevant to today's context. With regard to the mobilizing of private capital, one important area that the countries need to work is risk mitigation and the risk underwriting. Substantial amount of capital is out there, but they don't come because of the risk, foreign exchange risk, interest risk, and also the country risk. So in this context, now let me highlight some of the initiatives that we have taken toward sustainable financing. These are including Sri Lanka Sustainable Financing Roadmap, and Green Finance Taxonomy, and Green Bond Framework, and also the SDG investor map. Central Bank of Sri Lanka developed and launched a roadmap for sustainable finance in Sri Lanka to facilitate and promote sustainable financing practices in consultation with the relevant government agencies, the industries, and a wide range of financial sector stakeholders. The roadmap provide guidance and support to financial institutions to effective managing environmental, social, and governance risk associated with the projects they finance, and increase support to the business that are greener, climate friendly, and socially inclusive. Then with regard to the green finance taxonomy, again, we have developed the green finance taxonomy with the technical support from IFC. The green finance taxonomy aims at promoting sustainable green financing activities in Sri Lanka based on the roadmap of sustainable finance. It provides a classification system for identifying activities or investment that will move the country towards meeting the specific targets related to priority environmental objectives, and address the needs of among financial market participants for clarity and the transparency in what is understood and what qualifies as green. Then green bond framework, as Mr. Hamza mentioned, the government has initiated the process of developing a green bond framework to support the country's SDGs and the Paris Agreement climate commitments. The framework is again expected to communicate how Sri Lanka intended to raise capital for climate adaptation and mitigation, both domestically and internationally. And then we are currently developing SDG budget tapping and coding system also. I think that's a very important area. This is essential to ensure that the policy priorities are expressed in the respective budgets. Otherwise, what will happen is there is likely to expect disconnects between the strategic planning frameworks that have made commitments to 2030 agenda on one hand, and the public budgets that remain driven by the business as usual on the other hand. So with the support of UNDP, Sri Lanka, the National Budget Department and the Sustainable Development Council of Sri Lanka are formulating a policy-based and standardized codification system that would identify, tag, and monitor SDG initiatives across government agencies through the national budget, so that we will be in a position to align our allocations from the national budget to these important areas. Then SDG Investor Map, the first ever SDG Investor Map was developed and launched by the UNDP Sri Lanka in collaboration with the Sustainable Development Council in Sri Lanka, and also the Board of Investment with the support of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. This is a market intelligence tool that helps the private sector identify investment themes in emerging markets with a significant potential to advance the SDGs and align to government policies and the national sustainable development needs and the commitments. Investor Map has identified 15 key investment opportunity areas under 5 priority sectors, of course, through a consultative and the stakeholder engagement process. So these areas are basically renewable energy, food and beverage, infrastructure, healthcare, and consumer goods. So this Investor Map will offer a compelling pathway for the private sector entities to increase the alignment of their investment with the SDGs to achieve our targets. I'll stop here, Chair, and happy to take any questions and further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Priyantha Ratnyake, Deputy Secretary to Treasury, Sri Lanka. Next up, we have Mr. Yusuf Estia, Expert, Strategy and Budget Office of Presidency of Turkey.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Turkey. I would like to mention about that the agenda for 2013 for sustainable development was created jointly and included ambitious and transformative goals for everyone. Turkey takes significant steps through national and international cooperation, capacity building, innovation, alternative funding methods, and particularly official development assistance to overcome the challenges in achieving the 2030 goals. I would like to draw your attention specifically on the official development assistance in my speech. So the official development assistance support constitutes the most important source of funding for the least developed countries. In line with this conviction, Turkey's official development assistance continues to increase annually and surpasses its commitments. With its culture of solidarity and humanitarian approach to vulnerable groups, Turkey endeavors to reach out everyone who needs help in the world, its neighboring countries being a priority. Thanks to this approach, Turkey has responded to asylum requests of a large population that migrated from Syria because of the humanitarian crisis started at 2011, and indiscriminately welcomed the foreigners who have come to the Turkish border by implementing an open door policy and admitted them to the country under temporary protection status. Syrians are now receiving services, especially in education, healthcare, and humanitarian needs under equal conditions with Turkish citizens. Up to the present, Turkey's expenditures out of its own resources for refugees have exceeded 37 billion United States dollars. Turkey promotes the principle of leaving no one behind, both at home and abroad, and advocates an increased voice for developing countries in the international decision-making mechanisms. In line with its policy of promoting regional and global stability, Turkey extends a helping hand to and support the development efforts of developing countries, including particularly the least developed countries. In this context, as an emerging donor country, Turkey shares its experiences with many countries as part of bilateral, multilateral, regional, and global partnerships. Turkey's official development assistance amount, which was 967 million US dollars in 2010, increased approximately ninefold and reached 8.7 billion US dollars in 2019. As a result, Turkey achieved an ODA over GNI ratio 1.1% in 2018 and become one of the countries reaching ODA over GNI ratio at least 0.7%, which is one of the SDG targets. This demonstrates Turkey's success in upholding the principle of leaving no one behind. In addition to ODA, the assistance provided to developing countries through direct investments by the private sector and non-governmental organization grants amounted to 826 million and 303 million US dollars respectively in 2018. COVID-19 pandemic strongly affected the amount of grants by private sector and NGOs. Grants from NGOs decreased from 8.26 million to 349 million US dollars, and private flows decreased from 303 million US dollars to 216 million US dollars. These development aids provided outside the public sector reached 7.9 billion US dollars in 2014 and 2019. Thus, the total volume of Turkey's development assistance during the same period exceeds 48 billion US dollars. So Turkey is working tirelessly to finance and implement SDGs, and we know that these goals can only be achieved through the principles of sustainable and human-centered development. We are aware that national goals can be attained through international solidarity and cooperation along with national vision. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf, Expert Strategy and Budget Office of Presidency of Turkey. Next, we have Mrs. Samina Nazir, President PODA, Pakistan. She is also a syndicate member of University of Chakwal, Punjab, Pakistan. After this, towards the end of the session, we can have a Q&A. So, welcome.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. Welcome to all our distinguished guests from many countries. I hope you're enjoying the new climate-induced weather in Pakistan. December is very cold usually, but it's quite warm this year. I'm very honored to be here today among such a distinguished panel, and I kept on wondering, what am I doing here? Because this whole finance is not my field, but it was very enlightening to learn new dimensions of how the financing issues impact the implementation of sustainable development goals. I run a women's rights organization in Pakistan and have one of the largest network of rural women leaders that work in more than 100 districts in Pakistan. And every year we bring them together to Islamabad once a year to connect them with the policymakers. And all of them are working in rural areas implementing the sustainable development goals. So because I'm from the civil society, I will take a perspective from our side. Some of the problems that we see in implementing and the financing issues related to the SDGs are very basic. We have a habit in Pakistan of starting everything from scratch. When we do something, we just dismantle whatever we have already and just start from zero, particularly in the government sector, I'm sorry to say. So I think that one of the problems we see is that there's no effort to integrate the implementation of sustainable development goal with the existing programs of the government. So there is a need to build on what already exists and to fill the gaps. So for example, if we want to, find financing for SGD related to education and women's empowerment or clean water and sanitation, we need to build more schools and we need to improve the existing schools. I'll give you an example how it affects a lot of the SGDs. So in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, which was one of the most heavily funded provincial government during the last 4 years, 50% of girls, when they pass primary school, the number of girls from primary to middle drops by 50%. So 50% of the girls will not enroll in middle schools in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Number one, because there are no schools, there are less middle schools than primary school. Number two, girls, a lot of the girls, most of the girls hit puberty when they start the middle school. Most schools don't have running water, don't have working or decent toilets. So parents are reluctant to send girls, and girls don't feel comfortable in school when there's no water and they need to use the washroom. And then because the girls are now growing older in the eyes of the families, there are transportation issues. So the girls who were allowed to walk or run to the school, primary school earlier, now after puberty, families don't allow them to go or walk or travel to school alone. So now they have to be chaperoned. So we need transportation. So to address this issue, we need to make the working school working, see where the gaps are. Maybe we can solve a problem instead of building a whole new school. We can just solve the problem by fixing the washroom in a girls' school. So there is need to, strategize and first improve the missing facilities and then really invest on things that are going to achieve not one sustainable development goal, but many, many development goals: education, sanitation, water, gender equality, reducing inequalities, better governance, all of those. Secondly, we have a serious problem with the NGO funding issues in Pakistan. It's also an issue of civic space. So majority of the NGOs in Pakistan, and there are a lot, are going through a very difficult time getting money to do anything. And sustainable development implementation is one of the core agendas of all NGOs. So, you know, we have a saying, don't fix what is not broken. NGOs in Pakistan are one of the most organized, competent, efficient, hardworking entities. And there's so much restriction in trying to stop us from working, starting with funding control. So right now, it is extremely difficult for any NGO in Pakistan to access money from abroad because the government has clubbed us with religious madrasas. So in the government category, religious institution, religious madrasas, religious organizations, all are branded as civil society. So for the FATF restrictions and all the fear and all the problems, we were being grilled the same way that you know, terrorist organization would be grilled. And we kept on telling the government, please separate apples and oranges. We are a registered organization. We have registered with the tax entity. Everything we do is on our website. We have annual audit. We have annual report. You're most welcome to come and check our offices. But because we were clubbed in this larger civil society, you know, half of the NGOs in Pakistan have shut down in the last 10 years. Number one, because of the restrictions. Number two, because of lack of funding, not only the Pakistani NGOs, but a lot of the international humanitarian and, you know, development organizations like ActionAid, one of the most radical organizations that supports rural development, they were all forced to leave the country because they were not allowed to function, had to get multiple registrations. So our request is, we want to implement SGDs. Let us implement SGDs. If you cannot facilitate, don't restrict. Don't fix what is not broken. Let it continue. NGOs can get their own money and do the work, but right now it is impossible. My NGO's bank account was shut down 2 weeks ago. I don't know why. We have given them every piece of paper on earth that they have asked for. And when we asked the bank, Standard Chartered, why have you shut down our account? They said, we get so many queries from the State Bank of Pakistan, government of Pakistan, that we have to hire new people just to answer the queries that they have about NGOs transaction. And that is putting too much pressure on our bank. So we have decided that we will not operate any NGO's account, any NPO's accounts, and any trust account. So Standard Chartered Bank has shut down all the NGO's account, all the NPO account, all the trust account. So this is the impact of, you know, funding issues. A lot of the speakers mentioned, you know, restrictions on banks. I was so happy to hear what Bhutan is doing. I want to move to Bhutan, that how they facilitate new businesses and how they've helped them to, you know, start working. And here, you know, people who want to work are not being allowed to work because of some very, you know, we understand that Pakistan has gone through a very, very difficult time with terrorist financing, terrorism issues, FATF restrictions. We are Pakistanis. We understand these issues. We support our government in the efforts to control these illegal means. But that does not mean that those who are working and want to implement on SGDs should also be restricted. We have a saying in Pakistan that if you are bitten by the snake, you're afraid of the rope. So now the restrictions and problems we had with the terrorist organizations are being forced on anybody who gets international funding. So in order to implement the sustainable development goals in Pakistan, I think that the government, the UN, all organizations should see NGOs, civil society organization, women groups as their right-hand allies, not as someone that they need to restrict and control and make them unable to work. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Mrs. Samina Nazib. Next up for special remarks, we have Senator Aisha Raza Farooq. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Am I allowed to speak from here, if you don't mind? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum ji, a very good afternoon. I'm going to keep my remarks short. So I have quite a few papers sitting here with questions, observations, but I don't want to stand in between you and lunch. And I know time's almost run up for this session. So I'm very, very happy to be here today. I'd like to thank STPI and UNESCAP for this very, very interesting conference. I've sat through various sessions, and today's was particularly interesting, where it's good to be amongst very, very honorable delegates from other countries, from South Asia. I just want to, so I've listened to what innovative interventions, measures different countries have suggested they are in the process of undertaking or are soon going to resort to for development funding here in order to achieve the very ambitious SDG Agenda 2030. However, I think keeping in line with the conference topic, talk about the conference overall talks about the triple C crisis here. There's COVID, there is the climate change, there is the conflict, a result of the recent Ukraine-Russia crisis here, which has really, we've seen, exacerbated problems for developing countries, LDCs, and all over here. And we also know that historically and empirically, we've seen that it is these less developed countries or developing countries which have accounted for a disproportionate increase in poverty, whether it was during COVID or historically, they have been hardest hit always. And we've seen these three crises. The triple C has also adversely affected their already weak productive sectors and their economies over here. So in my view, given the ambitious scale of the SDGs, the financial wherewithal required is going to be the most complex bottleneck in achieving the goals. A challenge which I feel is going to be especially acute for developing countries, and not just for Pakistan here, but for many other countries in our region over here. We also know, and we've learned from the very interesting presentation that Dr. Hamza made, that these countries all countries are facing issues of recession, there is inflation, but particularly these countries where you see increase in debt servicing costs, fiscal deficits very high, and some of these issues are going to linger on for a while here. So these have already put, there's a dearth already, therefore, of domestic financing resourcing, which in my opinion, I think makes external source of funding all the more critical and vital here. And I think this is where the rich nations of the world need to step forward. I agree with what has been said, that countries must take responsibility themselves, and we need to create fiscal space as much as possible and prioritize the use of funding to promote SDGs. That's correct. But if you look at Pakistan, if you look at the havoc the recent floods have created, they were of a biblical nature, really. Never, ever has such devastation been witnessed in my country, where 33 million people are sleeping or forced to sleep under the open sky. 1/3 were displaced. So all kinds of non-essential funding, whatever development funds that we had to be diverted towards rehabilitation of the flood victims here. And it's still a very, very long way to go. They've lost their livelihoods. And it is similar kinds of challenges that we see other countries in South Asia face simultaneously. So while I agree that we need to prioritize financing for development domestically, I do think we need to look at external solutions, and some of these have been pointed out already, but very quickly, infrastructure financing. I think for countries like ours, we need to create resilient, sustainable investments over here. So investment in health, for example, gender equality, housing, agri, sanitation is something that we could look at with Multilaterals, thank you. Concessional loans. I think this is the time, if ever, to look at or to give concessional loans to developing countries over here. What about incentivizing domestic investment through matching grants? The rich nations have a lot of money. So if you want to make sure that countries themselves rise up to the occasion, why not look at incentivizing that for us through matching grants over here? Debt restructuring has already been mentioned, and that I think allows for more fiscal space for long-term structural transformations and for sustainable development goals achievement here. And at the same time, I think there is a need for improving efficiency and effectiveness of the delivery mechanism also, of how this funding reaches here, is utilized. That needs to be done too. So I do think it is about time that SDG financing in the developing countries should be made an explicit focus of priority over here. And I'm reminded of most recently the COVID pandemic, where we saw the world, the rich nations of the world get together. We saw them raise trillions of dollars of funding for the developing countries. We saw stimulus packages being given. And I'm forced to ask, why just for COVID? Why did the world, the rich nations, why were they not shaken up? Why were they not moved when the climate change catastrophe hit Pakistan? When food insecurity hits other countries, less developed countries of the world? Is it because COVID was seen as an existential threat and climate exigencies are not an existential threat for the rich nations of the world? So I do think that I'm leaving this as food for thought for the audience and for the panelists over here, that we need to, if we want to ensure under the SDG agenda that no one is left behind, then there is a serious need for the rich nations of the world to come together. And this is not charity. This is not charity that we're asking for. I think that this is a right that developing countries must by right demand of the richer nations. Because if we want to grow together, and if we want to ensure no one's left behind, then I do think we need to seriously consider this development of funding is given to us. And there are many, many innovative ways that were discussed today that are being practiced by other countries represented on the panel here. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. We can move to a Q&A if anyone has a question and wants to ask the specific panelist. Yeah, sure. Questions can be cross panel as well. So we can start with you, Senator Aisha.
Sorry, forgive me. I'm sitting here. Just had a question, and thank you for reminding me. So, Dr. Hamza, I have a question for you. In one of your very interesting slides, you put up how data is compiled for different countries. South Asia, Pakistan was one. What percentage of our GDP or other countries need to invest in to ensure that they're on track to achieve SDG 2030 goals? And for Pakistan, that stood at a huge 17%. So I'm just concerned here that when you're putting these numbers together, are we looking at the pragmatic side, at the practicalities here? I mean, 17% for a country like Pakistan with the kind of fiscal space we've had historically ever since inception, not just how we've lost that space because of recent floods, but how does the 70% figure come up from, and is it practical, and should it be there up on the slide at all?
Certainly should be there on the slide. The point is the needs of developing countries, South Asia, are enormous, right? And the point is they cannot meet them on themselves. The part I showed is what we call pillar 1, component 1 of the IMF, which is actually first step, figuring out how much do you need. There's part 2, part 3, part 4. Part 2 actually is about financing strategies. So the situation varies from country to country. Doing country-specific work, what kind of financing strategies can actually help close that gap? For some, it could be more emphasis on taxation. For some, it could be spending efficiency. For some, it could be blended finance. For some, could be so on and so forth, right? So that is the whole framework. I simply mentioned one component as an example to drive the point home that significant efforts are needed. So let's first acknowledge the scale of the problem, which, as you rightly said, is just not doable, right? It's just enormous.
So just to push the policymakers, say, look, this is a huge task, and it's not over yet. We are in a very difficult macro conditions right now. You referred to climate change at the moment, wreaking havoc, including in Pakistan, in shape of floods, right? The situation is going to become worse and worse, right? And financing needs are always going to be there. They're already there. Just one small observation. You said something very interesting. When we did this estimate for the region, it was 1.5 trillion or 5% of GDP for Asia Pacific as a whole. It was told that, oh, this is too enormous, it cannot be done. When the pandemic hit in 1 year, countries did spend 1.8 trillion because they perceived it as an existential threat. So they have the resources. They were able to demonstrate that. Why they're not doing it like you rightly asked for the climate change, for instance, right? So there is a lot of room to actually scale up finance. A lot of ideas are there. Some countries are doing better than others, but more homework needs to be done.
We had some hands raised from over there. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is Ali from Iran. First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for their interesting and very useful remarks and interventions. My comment goes mainly to, it's not a question, it's a comment, very short, to Mr. Hamza Malek. Mr. Hamza Malek and many other interlocutors and people who have their speech, they used to use the new concepts or the concepts that is nowadays daily by daily more on the use by many thinkers, many specialists, and especially in the within the frame of international organization secretariats, and it is very daunting. And the concept is no innovative tools or means for financing. This is really alarming because we have to be very, very careful on this concept. And the risk and danger for that is that it is not the agenda for developing countries. It is the agenda for developed countries who are committed to support as donor to developing countries for their projects to be implemented. When you say innovative finance mechanism, you means that you are going to shift and get away from the means for financing, which is under the commitments made by developed countries in implementing and fulfilling their tasks in relation to their historical responsibility. For example, in the field of climate change action funding. The point is that when we use innovative, it means that we may get distance from public finance. We keep distance from loans, from lends to loans, from public to private, from ODA to bankable funding projects. Means when it's come to this kind of new blended innovative mechanism, it means that we are eluding the commitments by developed countries to support developing countries. So this is something that we have to be very careful. Thank you.
Would you want to comment on that?
Very quick observation. Thank you for highlighting that. Certainly not. The world is not black and white. There are hundreds of shades of gray, which means not all, there are no mutually exclusive policies that can be pursued. Innovation can be used in many settings. It doesn't mean if you're going in that direction, it's being dictated by the West, and we are not going to fulfill the responsibilities that lie on the developed countries to support developing countries. The entire issue of climate justice being raised right now. UN just set up loss and damage fund at COP27 earlier last month, right? So there's no and or approach. A simple example I shared was the use of technology, innovative use of technology, artificial intelligence to enhance tax administration's capacity to raise revenues. That's a simple tool. It doesn't mean if you're doing that, you're not pursuing other policies. So it's not an and or approach, but overall observation well taken. Thanks.
Do we have another question? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sumbal Wahab, Senior CSR Officer, Senior Corporate Social Responsibility Officer at OJDCL. So, as Dr. Hamza explained, 17% of GDP is required to achieve the target, and in Pakistan, it's less than 3% at the moment. My question is, what role can the corporates play? Is it possible to achieve the target if government bounds the corporate sector and make it obligation towards the noble cause? Secondly, for government itself, it's not possible to achieve such huge targets. So what role can both the public and private organizations play? Thank you.
Yeah, go. No, I don't think so. Any government, Pakistan otherwise, should dictate corporates to do these things. What the term we use is creating enabling environment, having conducive regulatory frameworks. We use the senator's framework phrase incentivizing in that sense. So there are several ways to do that, how corporates can pitch in supporting the government's requirements of financing, but dictation or requiring them to do so is not the way to go about doing that. There are regulatory changes that can be considered, which is, you can say, nudging in that direction, encouraging them, giving them incentives. Corporates, at the end of the day, are there to make profits, and that's perfectly all right. We should allow them to do that. However, what needs to be done by policymakers is allow them to make profits in a manner that supports the sustainable development agenda. So that's the kind of slight distinction and differentiation that has to be there.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry we're running out of time. So can we have a group photo before the panelists leave? I'd like to thank each one who has come from so far away and been a part of this, great discussion. Thank you.